I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lee Bogue, and I am hyped for this one. I'm also, by the way, personally glad and slightly touched to see some of our students present. I like to think you can't get enough of hearing us talk. Now, Lee is a psychology lecturer at RGU. His PhD is in developing wellbeing interventions, and he's fanatical about qualitative research methods, never more comfortable than when he's discussing hermeneutics. He's spoken at international conferences. He's published in international journals about therapeutic techniques and modalities. He's also, as you can guess from the subject here, an avid gamer, and he sees this passion as an extension of his research. And whether it's board games, video games, or RPGs, he thinks the most important thing is we should all be gaming more. Should also add that Dr. Bogue here has a very strict deadline of 7:30 because that's when his next round of D&D starts. Now, I've spoken to Lee many times about psychology. I've spoken to him many times about gaming, but I've never really discussed the psychology of gaming with him in any depth. And as such, it pleases me to say, welcome, Dr. Bogue.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for showing up. As David says, this is very much a passion project of mine since joining the School of Applied Social Studies a few years ago. And when my line manager said, what do you want to research? And I was like, I get to choose? She said, yeah. And I went, can I do games? And she more sheepishly said, yeah. And we've been on that course since. Managed to rope some colleagues in on some research projects that are currently ongoing, and got students ranging from undergrad to masters to doctoral level that are doing research in benefits of gaming, which is amazing. It's so great to see my passion for it emulated through other people, and hopefully tonight people are here out of polite interest will be convinced that gaming and doing more gaming is beneficial. People who are gaming can maybe recognize the transformative potential they already access. And my secret, not so secret agenda is to really push tabletop role-playing games, but we'll get on to that. So am I good to start sharing my slides, David?
Absolutely. Now, just so we heads up, if you've got any questions, there will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If anything that Lee says makes you think, oh, I want to know more about that. But we will, however, have the chat open throughout as well. Don't ask any sidetrack questions. If you wish to join in the banter, then do feel free to add a contribution. Lee, feel free to take us away.
So, mainly because David leads these seminars and he likes a pun, what are we playing at? Is the benefits of gaming. So I want to explore the benefits that games have, all the way from, say, board games to video games to tabletop role-playing games. For the people who aren't as avid gamers, I will try and break down some of the terminology. So today is going to be quite a general overview. So first off, why are games important? From recent studies, we can see over 90% of children from the ages of 2 to 17 play video games. That's a massive, massive number. We see a trend from the millennial generation through to Gen Z, possibly even Gen Alpha, where video games are becoming more and more commonplace within our world. So it's not just a case of understanding what's there, but how we can refine, enhance, and optimize these opportunities for gaming to be of benefit to us. From a very biological standpoint, we see evolutionary advantages across animal species where younger animals are involved in what's referred to as play, but what is defined as infantile experiments. So arguing the concept of imagination across non-human animals is probably a different talk, but we can see play emulated across different species. And we have to really ask ourselves, well, why? Why do we do it? Why do we enjoy it? Why do so many of us do it? One of the biggest things for me, I think, is that it allows us to access experiences beyond our real life. We have constructed a society whereby play is almost sidelined, and I would like to argue that it should be incorporated more across work, education, and not just be seen as a reward for work, but I'll come back to that. It's an opportunity to connect with other people. We see such high levels of social anxiety and loneliness within modern society that we really can use games as a way to support connections and bringing people together, to enhance social connections, to create new ones. We're seeing a shift in education and a higher appreciation for the gamification of education. Young people now are growing up within technology. I mean, I was about 15 or 16 before I even got a mobile phone, but you can see young people with tablets. They're in environments, virtually created environments that are there to create immersive experiences. And then we wonder when they come to uni that students aren't as engaged with a standard PowerPoint as they used to be. We need to embrace this technological advancement, because it's not going to go anywhere. If anything, it's getting stronger as time goes on. I was really pleased to see the longitudinal study by Przybylski and Weinstein in 2019, which showed that there wasn't an actual association with violence and aggression in video games, because obviously games being a passion of mine, the first thing somebody on the opposition says, well, games make you aggressive. They can increase perhaps temporary aggression in response to actions within games, but we see no long-lasting or personality, state or trait changes in aggression. However, that's not to say that games can't change us, and they do. We see people who actively engage in altruistic behaviors in games reflected in real life. So we don't see aggression being replicated, but altruistic pro-social behaviors are. So we do have the option for the transformative, translational benefit of games, and it does seem to be very positively focused. So, as most of my students and perhaps colleagues will know, I really dislike play being framed as the opposite of work. Work and play have such a great overlap. It's just that perhaps we have set ourselves up, maybe through the educational system of your golden time, or the fact that gaming is a hobby, that we see it as a treat. We see it as something to be rewarded, as a reward, sorry. And there's perhaps a societal misunderstanding of what gaming actually is. People that don't do it don't really know much about it. I've played games since I was 5 or 6, when I got a Sega Mega Drive. I've been a console gamer since, and it wasn't really till lockdown that I got into tabletop role-playing games. You know, Zoom meetings with friends got really boring when nobody was up to anything, so there was no discussion to be had. And I finally bit the bullet, started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and haven't really turned back since. There's also perhaps a generational bias in that games have evolved over time to become more complex, to become more dynamic. And maybe there is a little bit more regard with the development of games into what benefits they produce, rather than just let's make a game that's fun and sells. We can see such a massive expansion across board games, ones that you can spend upwards of 70 quid on that take half an hour to set up, different platforms, different concepts. And again, this goes hand in hand with the progress of technology. We've gone from games that had to fit on standard cartridges, all the way up to massive open worlds that we have now. So when we think about games and play, a critical point of play is the voluntary participation, is that we choose to engage in it. We may not always choose to engage in work, but we choose to engage in play. So what I want us to consider is, when we're playing, what avenues we have for exploration, for learning and improvement. And it's from Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken that best articulated this, in that play isn't the opposite of work, because it is the voluntary participation in overcoming unnecessary obstacles. We put things to solve in our way for a sense of mastery, a sense of purpose. We create difficulties for ourselves to engage in. And I find that really interesting, because it's that active engagement and sense of purpose, sense of achievement, whatever you want to call it. We do it because we feel rewarded by it. So what does all that actually contribute to us? A key concept that I really enjoy is the state of flow. And you'll know what flow is because you'll have been in it. You'll have watched a movie that felt like it lasted 5 minutes. You'll have read an entire book in a day. You'll have sat down in front of your games console or a table with your friends to play, and hours will pass. Flow is being in the moment. So it's kind of linked to the concept of mindfulness. But the stance of flow is really about rewards and achievement. So you can see from this diagram here, it's a balance of anxiety and boredom. So we want to be challenged without that challenge overcoming and tipping into anxiety, and without it dipping into boredom. We want a balance of engagement. And flow is that immersive state that we enjoy, that you get that sense of purpose, that sense of enjoyment, enthusiasm. It's all within that concept of flow. And when we're playing board games and video games are specifically set up in ways that as the game progresses and you get better, you'll become more challenged, because without it, really adapt players will become bored very quickly. So in video games, we can see this through leveling up and progressions and maybe access to different areas once you've been able to demonstrate the capacity and develop that skill to engage without it tipping over, unless you're somebody who plays Dark Souls, because the challenge rating of that is so high that I worry about what you're getting out of that. Because that definitely is an exception to the rule. So when we're designing games, we need to constantly think, how do we make sure that as people get better at this, they still enjoy it? Well, it's by still challenging them. But the challenge for us in developing games is to question, in what parameters do you make that more difficult? And is it meaningful? So you've got your open world platform games that you can do 100% of achievements by spending 60, 70 hours, doing Merlin trials, for example. Is that much of a challenge at a certain point, or is it a tick box exercise? We can lose that state of flow if we don't have a reason or a value for that skill anymore. And many sociologists and many psychologists question whether or not the modern world provides us with a state of flow. Depending on your job, your education, whatever it is you're actively engaged in, are we within a flow state? Does time pass with that sense of challenge without it becoming anxiety or boredom? Is the world we are in, up to 8, 10, 12 hours a day, whatever it is, demonstrative with this? And if it's not, why not? Why can we not change things to become that rewarding flow state? Games provide us with a safe space. We are in a society that values perfectionism, that meritocracy. Students always want the best grades possible. We always want to do the best jobs possible in work. We're very good at measuring outcomes over long periods of time and maybe contributing to a cog in a wheel, not to sound pessimistic, but when you do your job perfectly and don't see the outputs, it kind of quells that state of purpose, that sense of contribution, and again, value. In a world of social media presentation where people show their best and ideal selves, we're constantly trying to strive for a state of perfection that maybe isn't actually sustainable. And that all feeds into our social identity. We see great detriments of self-esteem, self-efficacy across the board. And a lot of that is to do with social comparison, but social comparisons of perfectionisms and idealism. Games allow us to fail in a safe space. They allow us to experience failure. And in some instances, so long as failure is interesting, we will persevere. It is a perseverance that has actual consequences, but within the game world, within a safe setting. So we don't have to touch our fragile egos of meritocracy and perfectionism in the real world. But within these settings, we can create these boundaries, these opportunities for people to explore, to take risk, to push themselves out of their comfort zones more so than what they do in real life. And that level of self-efficacy, that learned behavior, that conditioning replicates into the real world. People become better at problem solving, more creative in their approaches to overcoming obstacles just by being involved in games and gaming. I have touched on this, but it's the observable impact of our efforts and labor. You'll know yourself, if you put a lot of time, effort, and energy into something, you want to see that output. And we also want to triumph over adversity. We want to challenge ourselves in such a way that we can thrive, that we can accomplish. And we can only do that when we see tangible effects. And that's what games give us, either in real time or by completing a level, by leveling up. We see some personification of our efforts, and that is the feedback we want. Hard work is then recognized and has a demonstrable output. That output isn't always directly observable. So when your sim gets a promotion, or you go through the skill tree in Final Fantasy, or you finish building an epic construction in Minecraft, or your team comes first in Call of Duty, you get achievements, all these things, they're intrinsic rewards because these are tangible examples, obviously, within the games of these outputs, but the true feelings and accomplishments are intrinsic. We can't see them. When we have external rewards, we have hedonic adaptation. So from the word hedonia for, gratification, but of things. We see, as much as I'm not saying if somebody gave me £1,000, I would be happy. Eventually there's a cutoff of how happy that is, and it diminishes over time. The more physical things we have, the less we appreciate them. That isn't true for intrinsic reward. As, from a humanist point of view, I suppose, we can really see people thriving, and we do not tend to see a diminishing return on intrinsic reward, or what's referred to as eudaimonic well-being. I think, especially within societies focused on capitalism, the American dream, we're sold that happiness is things. It is your house, your car, your watch, whatever it is. We see it through conspicuous consumerism, that we tie identity and achievement into things, but observable things, so we can demonstrate it to other people. Intrinsic reward isn't necessarily directly observable. Granted, it'll make you a lot happier, and when somebody is experiencing high levels of happiness and well-being, we can see that. But it's about taking that focus and reprioritizing that well-being and intrinsic factors should be more important than hedonic ones. Games also give us relatively short-term feedback. We don't have to wait long until the game tells us if we're doing right or we're doing wrong. If we're doing wrong, we get that sense of challenge, we can overcome it. If we're doing right, we see in some demonstrable way that we are getting better. A focus on intrinsic well-being actually helps us develop personal strengths and increase social relationships. So we play games with other people, we can start to develop a shared intrinsic reward, a sense of group purpose, social democracy. And this all leads to satisfying work. So it's not, again, play is not the opposite of work. Play is satisfying work that we voluntarily engage ourselves in to overcome these unnecessary obstacles that we put in place. So I think it's very interesting in a society that values working and being tired at the end of the day to demonstrate you've done something, that games are kind of similar, but something we choose to do that provides us with great intrinsic reward. And as I've said, it's that observable product of achievement. The more recent you'll see in game development, there is always some kind of percentage completion or tracks and stats, because people want to look back over what they've done and what they've achieved. And that is that ultimate affirmation of effort, something that recognizes the hard work and dedication we put into something. So I quite like this graph. Let me try and move this bar so I can see it too. Nope, okay. So we can see games based and mapped across their complexity and their involvement in social aspects. These are two key components as to the benefits of games. We've got the social aspects, which help us mitigate things like loneliness. We've seen it combat social anxieties, it improves confidence, it improves friendships, it improves strengths of relationships. And complexity, again, tying back on what I said about production and intrinsic value. So for the gamers amongst you, you can maybe have a look and see where some of your favorite games sit. From the bottom left corner, we see puzzle games like Bejeweled or Candy Crush. They're simple, they're non-social, but there's still that sense of purpose. You get feedback, all the bright colors light up. Candy Crush is actually designed in such a way that if you get a streak of levels, it will increase the challenge of it to keep you going because they understand the concept of flow. They want to make sure that you don't win all the time, so you keep trying and have a meaningful accomplishment rather than an easy win, which is going to taper out. On the more social side, we can see things like party games when they're relatively simple. And then if we increase complexity, we've got multiplayer shooters, World of Warcraft, strategy games. And in our less social, we've got role-playing games. So not to be confused with tabletop role-playing games being a social community thing. These are things like Final Fantasy, Dragon Age, sandbox games like Sims and other games that you set the parameters for yourself. So they're complex in regards to you setting the rules, but they're still not social, but maybe have a social element where they have characters within the game you can chat to, romance, those kind of things. So just to break down some of the concepts, maybe some of the less familiar gamers, we've got multiplayers and massive multiplayer online games, which are role-playing games, but video games within online settings where there's a big focus on collaboration and connection. We can see from the research that very introverted people like playing alongside other people, not necessarily with. And MMOs were the first kind of tipping point where social interaction, guilds, party quests started to be rewarded. It pushed people a little bit further out of their comfort zone. So these people who may have originally been solo gamers started to create these massive social networks and connections within these games. And I think MMOs are probably indicative of how video games are becoming more collaborative, not just competitive. One of my favorite games to play online competitively is Civilization. I love that, but I play it with some of my friends, and if you were to go to war with your friends, not come out of the game, you're playing a single player game again. It doesn't really fit. Whereas collaboration in this sense of community, where the game is designed around guilds, party quests, produces this shared purpose and commonality. So we don't just have production anymore, we've got group production. And there's a big argument as whether community fosters group projects or group projects fosters community. Perhaps it's symbiotic in both directions. Within these MMOs, we see a great development of pro-social emotions. We see an enhancement in turn-taking, problem-solving, social democracy. There's also the concept of social teasing and happy embarrassment, because we're playing in games, and again, games aren't fun if we win all the time. This ties back into that concept of failure and failure in a safe space. And if there's anybody you can fail with, it's with friends. And again, that falls back to the happy embarrassment. We have these aspects of not necessarily achieving the desired goal, but having done something. And it is that level of social teasing that acts almost as a vaccination against more harsh teasing or bullying. We become a little bit more robust, and we become less scared of doing and saying the wrong things. It becomes a more supportive and safe space, again, enabling that creativity, getting people to try. Within MMOs, one of the positive psychology emotions that we don't have a word for in English, but it's nachas. And that is the pride in seeing somebody else achieve, knowing you've contributed to that achievement. We see this a lot, not necessarily named and framed as such, because if we don't have a word for it, we tend not to view it in that way, is that people want to help new players and they see them achieve. And I think within a more individualistic society, it's really nice to have those moments where we can create community and experience nachas. It's thought to have evolved from a simple evolutionary concept whereby it would increase social cohesion. We have group survival. If you help other people and feel good about doing it, you're more likely to do it. So there's social mechanism goes beyond that. We form groups, we get a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, we get a sense of reward. And I think that's where a really strong aspect of the social components of these types of games come in. Role-playing games. So in this instance, I mean video games. The first thing that comes to mind for RPGs is escapism. And I would question what level of escapism we have, because what extent do we actually play the character? Some people will do, the worst possible outcome of games where they pick all the bad choices. But RPGs are more and more structured around communication, building friendships, building relationships with the other non-playable characters or NPCs within the games. They allow us to make social choices. So it moves beyond the standard, this is the desired outcome, this is the end of the level, to something more open world. But the danger with open worlds is it needs to be open world in a substantiated way. It can't be open world for the sake of it. Within RPGs, we can see moral dilemmas, which lend it a sense of purpose, a sense of more realness, because we have, again, those consequences and outcomes of our actions. When our actions have consequences, we value them more, we're more invested. And we provide that value based upon the importance of consequences and how real those are personified to us, how much they're fed back, how much we can see them in the world. In gaming design, it's referred to as phasing. For example, Fable 3 is a good example of phasing, whereby the choices you make are replicated in the world. Do you spend a bunch of money to convert the factory into an orphanage, or do you let the children continue to work in the factory, but you save money, which goes towards the end goal? The game actually almost forces you to make moral choices you wouldn't want to, because the more money you spend throughout that game to make good moral choices, you're less likely to actually win the game at the end. Spoiler alert, it's been out for a while. But RPGs also touch upon that part of connecting with something bigger than ourselves. We get to, again, ties back to escapism, I suppose, but we engage with things beyond our current life world and our current routines. So within the games, you might play as a character that saves the world. I don't think many of us would. And if anybody listening does save the world, come back to me and let me know, I'll buy you a coffee. But even playing a character who saves the world, you get a taste of it. You don't 100% experience it, but it's the closest most of us will get to experiencing that. Or, whatever it is you want to achieve in these games out with your normal day-to-day life, this is the opportunity for you to immerse yourself in it and experience part of what it would be to do that. And I think there's something more in that I really want to look into with my research. Seligman, who's the founding father of positive psychology, said the self is a very poor site for meaning. And that is very true. If our meanings or our actions, consequences are social connections. And that's where RPGs really demonstrate that resonance with the overlap between life and game. And lastly, tabletop role-playing games. Tabletop role-playing games being ones that can be done at a table, as their namesake is, or online, but with a group of people who have playable characters, and the outcomes of decisions are rolled with dice. So rather than video games where you do inputs and buttons, a lot of this is determined by rolling dice and adding different scores to see success of different actions. They are led by games masters who will narrate the world around them and narrate their consequences of their actions, their choices, while the players themselves can communicate and role play with each other as their characters. This level of exploration and autonomy for me is what puts TTRPGs at the top of games for their positive potential, because they are so open world. The only limitations of a TTRPG is your own imagination and the games master's ability to narrate the world and create it around you. There is shared purpose. You create a shared narrative. It's a shared story amongst the players, but overall it's a group directed mission, I suppose, but the missions can constantly change and evolve. One game, you could be playing a very stereotypical Lord of the Rings based fantasy game, and the following week you play all your characters are on a spaceship and doing the Spelljammer books. There's so much diversity that the games are more open world than what technology can be. And I think, especially with all the technological advances of the modern day, to say that our collective imaginations and social groups are still stronger really depicts the best part of these games. With that level of autonomy, we are in still that safe space, a safe space with shared successes and shared failures. Most TTRPGs characters are purposely designed to be really good at something and not so good at something else. It fosters collaboration and it allows us to be good at things we maybe aren't in real life. You know, I can't remember what it was. It was it was a TV show that said, oh, of course, of course, in D&D, charisma is a superpower because you're all a bunch of nerds. You know, I'm saying that none of us have charisma. But we can be things that we aren't in our day-to-day lives. So there's that level of wish fulfillment. When I took the concept of character creation to one of my counselling classes, there was one of my students who was, you know, quite a small female student who said that she would like to play a barbarian because she never gets to feel big and tough. And in that game, it allows people to feel, to experience, or be good at what they want to be. So it takes that onus of perfectionism away, but also that concept of shared but safe failure. Not achieving something in a TTRPG isn't necessarily the end of the world. It can be narrated, it can be ironically turn out to be a good thing to have not been able to achieve what you've done. But it allows us to experience not doing what we believed perfect in the moment and not have real world consequences. The dichotomy there is that in TTRPGs, there's no save point. There's no, oh, I said the wrong thing, or oh, I missed that particular part. I'll save and I'll reload an earlier save. This gives a little bit more meaning to TTRPGs because your agency within the world, your consequences are more real, but in a safe imaginary setting. So there's a weird dichotomy there. TTRPGs foster cooperation because the whole point is that you'll succeed together. You will use your collective strengths. With the element of chance, we can blame the dice for failures too. It's not necessarily us. We can blame perhaps a character, we can blame a dice roll, but the onus of responsibility for failure is taken away and it allows people, again, that safer space to try, to go beyond what they normally would do. The element of wish fulfillment, I suppose, is that we all have aspects of things we want in our lives, and we can get that and experience that within games. And a good games master asks the players, what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? That can be so diverse or collective that as the games progress, people will get closer and closer to these things and see them. And that's one of the biggest, I think, benefits of TTRPGs is death and failure. And it sounds really funny to say. Speaking to games masters who run games with young people, my concern was in my head was, well, your death is quite a big, scary thing. Should we really be doing this? And I actually think young people players take it better than adult players. You know, there's some game masters will say, well, you know, you can find a way to get your character back, but within a TTRPG, your character can die. And that seems like a really interesting therapeutic potential for these games is to cope with loss, to cope with indefinite loss, I suppose. And we tie that back into failure, where we say that we have an opportunity for this safe place for us to be, for us to try and not necessarily always succeed. I can go into these in so much more detail, but we'd be here for hours. So if people have questions specifically to these things, please do make note of them in the chat. So the last part of my talk, I want to just cover the benefits of tabletop role-playing games specifically, because they, to me, are the pinnacle of potential here in regards to positive psychology. Positive psychology was, as I said, founded by Seligman. I've been breadcrumbing our way to positive psychology, who came up with what is called the PERMA model. And it has 5 components that contribute to our psychological well-being. It comprises of positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And I'm always scared when I've not written that down that I'll forget one of them. It's a shift away from the traditional psychological focus on negative aspects of health and behaviour. And that's not to say that we don't see benefits of TTRPGs in mitigating things like anxiety and depression. We do. But for today, I wanted to focus on their positive and transformative potential. It is the scientific study of optimal human functioning, where we look at thriving, not just surviving. And games, to me, or TTRPGs specifically, not just games, but also games, really embodies that positive potential, that aspect of including something in our lives that demonstrates an inclusion of well-being. If we look at the psychological abstracts from 1967 to 2000, you can see there's such an imbalance between focusing on more negative aspects compared to positive ones. And I mean, that's changing gradually now. And I think as positive psychology increases, as does the attention in gaming, as we recognize what true potential it really has. But I want to demonstrate the link between those 5 components of the PERMA model and TTRPGs. So positive emotions are states or feelings. They can't be generated at will. It's not a case of pointing at somebody and going, be happy. If that worked, positive psychology wouldn't be as impactful as it probably is. It is instilling these states and feelings within people. They're vital to well-being. They are critical to our positive and eudaimonic development. They have amazing benefit to overall health and cognition. And they can shift our focus onto what is good, which shifts our attentional bias. We can change our outlook and actually generate optimism just by changing our focus to positive things within our life. It creates that aspect of instigating positive emotion, but actually makes us more inclined to involve ourselves and interpret things positively. So within TTRPGs, we see immersion and imagination providing and evoking positive emotions, that level of being within that world, that concept, being able to indulge in that aspect of creativity leads to such, massive experiences of excitement, happiness, amusement, fun. We can be rewarded for curiosity, for problem solving, for creativity. We like, again, going back to what I said about productivity, we like for our efforts to be recognized. There's also the joy of the shared narrative. You're contributing to something substantial, something meaningful. All the players around the table put their input and story, and you share that together as it develops. And it comes back to that exploration and autonomy of TTRPGs. The flexibility and freedom that these provide mean we're not stuck within the barriers of the game developers, but we are at the beck and call, I guess. It's a two-way relationship from players and games masters. The world you create and the world they inhabit within it. The opportunities and the world the games masters provide, and the interactions and meaning the players bring to it. Engagement is when we're absorbed in an activity. It's that level of immersion, being steeped in it. And as I said earlier, that state of flow where we balance challenge and excitement against boredom and lack of skill, where we are focused and can stay in the present moment, where we're totally transfixed upon what we're doing and really soaking in that intrinsic reward, finding that balance of challenge, fulfillment, and positively losing track of time. And again, for any gamers out there who go, oh, I've spent the whole day gaming, think about the intrinsic value that has provided. All of these positive things I've discussed happen. It's just perhaps we need to take a different stance or even just sit back and appreciate these changes as and when they occur. Engagement is both by player and games master. We can see in experienced players, it's been documented in studies that veteran or experienced players will create characters with greater deficits to overcome or increased weaknesses. So again, we can see that people are actively shifting to still be in that flow state. And what I think is great about TTRPGs is it's live, it is reactionary, it is genuine, where games masters can allow players to get to the very edge of what they feel is possible, to really challenge them. And again, the more meaningful the challenge, the more intrinsic value, reward, and perceived production we have. The interaction and freedom within the world allows us to engage in what we're interested in. It allows players autonomy to have different interests within this shared goal, which creates their identity, which feeds their sense of purpose. Again, that sense of shared successes and shared failures within the shared narrative. Those real consequences and outcomes that have a demonstration of your impact and agency designed within that phasing component of the world that you're steeped in. Relationships. So we're predisposed to be social animals, to interact with other people, which means we have to understand, regulate, and cope with emotions. Well-being in relationships goes both ways. We contribute equally to each other. And it's normally through simple acts of compassion and thoughtfulness that can be greatly impactful. And to me, I've experienced this firsthand playing tabletop role-playing games. The social component is massive, and I wish I got into D&D sooner, but at least I'm doing it now. Tabletop role-playing games focus on social interactions and teamwork. We see improvements across the hidden curriculum in schools with turn-taking, problem-solving, social democracy, coping and regulating with emotions in regards to other people. We see improved relationships, not just in their quality, but also their strength and their endurance. We see that level of social democracy where we can try to get our points across without trying to be too domineering. We learn how to be fair, share responsibility, share achievements, but then share purpose as a group. And it is such a safe space for inclusion. We see a massive amount of people with either social anxiety or other social-based difficulties that people feel that they want to engage, but in this way, because you are personifying yourself through a character, we take one step away. You still get to experience social interactions, but you have a slight buffer. We also have a safe space in regards to LGBTQIA+ people. We see a massive proportion of those people in those communities engaging in these games because it's a sense of community, it is a sense of purpose. And I think we are gradually losing what sociologists refer to as our third space. Our first space being our home, our second space being our job. Our third space is meant to be our community, be that the Legion, the pub, the community centre, whatever it is. Gaming allows us to create, either in person or remotely and online, a digital or real world gaming third space where people have a sense of individuality, but a sense of society, a sense of identity. And I think as our physical third spaces are being reduced, it really brings in the potential of gaming to be that third space. Also within relationships, it's your role within the party, what you contribute, what you're good at. All characters are designed to be good at something specifically. It gives people a sense of purpose and achievement, which feeds back into their identity. And then, their self-esteem, their self-efficacy, their belief in themselves is enhanced by this. I've only got 2 more to go, then I'm going to do Q&A. Meaning, which to me is a little bit more abstract, and that's why the AI-generated pictures are going to get weirder for these two, because they are more abstract in concept. Meaning is what you find meaningful and worthwhile. It is a sense of purpose, it is a sense of belonging, perhaps. It is the capacity to understand being something beyond ourselves. The causes within society are something personal that provides us with a sense of direction and spirituality. The best way I've tried to come up with this to my students is saying it acts as an existential anchor. It lends itself to a way of rooting and holding on to making sense of the world and our place in it. So to create and generate this meaning, this purpose, in TTRPGs, we have moral dilemmas and choices. Choices that lead to outcomes that are demonstrative of our production and the importance of what we've done, how they're replicated and experienced in that game world. We see character and group motivations. Characters will come with their own backstories and their own needs and desires, and games masters can tease that out to see, well, what would actually give your character purpose. It's also, as I said, being something bigger than yourself, experiencing the unexperienceable. I said that weird because I don't think it's an actual word, but it is accessing something beyond ourselves. It is character development and journeys that give us purpose and a sense of meaning. And again, it all ties into that shared narrative about production, shared direction, consequences, purpose. And lastly, accomplishment. Accomplishment is what and when you want to achieve, a sense of competence and mastery. And this ties back to our outputs, providing us with evidence that we are productive, our efforts have meaning. It links with pride and success. And we have to think about the ideal self and self-actualization. So trying to become a better version of ourselves. And we do, as I said, see replications of altruism from games as just one example of the transformative potential of interacting with games and how it can change us for the better. So we see this by accomplishing goals. It is goal-driven. We have character sheets that directly represent growth and development as your characters progress and get more abilities and can achieve more things. We have pride with these successes. And it's a real-time balance by games masters to make sure accomplishments are meaningful, but also become progressive and more. With TTRPGs, there's not so much winning the game as there is a definitive output in video games. And I'm not saying that winning the game isn't a good accomplishment in itself, but TTRPGs, the goalpost can be consistently moved and in whatever direction the players articulate it to. An accomplishment can be demonstrated by achievements in things like getting loot, better magical items, weapons, and the one question and Bandit asking at most tables is, did we level up? It is the culmination in TTRPGs of being able to make your character even better as reward for your efforts of being that character, engaging in that world. So lastly, potential applications, and these are just a few. We can use TTRPGs and games as interventions because they are enjoyable. We enjoy gaming. They're also seemingly voluntary. This is especially true of, I think it's true of all people, that if somebody tells you to do something when you're on your way to do it, you instantly go, I don't want to do it now. When we choose to be part of an intervention, we're more likely to stick at it. There are relatively low resources needed compared to alternative therapies and interventions. I know, a lot of people pay a lot of money for D&D Beyond and Foundry and lots of different things, but still compared to other therapies, it is relatively less resources needed. We have to consider the wider, maybe wiser, use of experienced games masters. These people have the potential to create these interventions, to lead them. All these things that I've just said across the PERMA model, the positive potential, production, social inclusion. If you were to frame and list these things to a funder and not say the word gaming, they would be surprised when you turn around and go, yeah, well, we're going to be playing Dungeons and Dragons or another TTRPG. We don't, as a society, recognize games as impactful and as beneficial as they are. Is there the possibility to train educators as games masters within schools, or arguably to support young people themselves? There are, I think, most academies now, or high schools, whatever you want to call them, have a D&D club because they recognize all these benefits, or some of these benefits. And in some instances, the young people themselves have taken on being games masters. So if you think there's a lot of cognitive and pedagogical educational benefits to being in the games, organizing and structuring your sheets, adding dice, the problem solving aspects, imagine the educational and cognitive benefits of actually designing the games, running the games, being that reflexive. We can see that it promotes well-being across all populations. It doesn't have to just be gamers. There can be levels of different advancements, difficulties designed to engage people. as I said, we see benefits across cognitive domains, social well-being outcomes. We see the therapeutic potentials. I've shown how it's linked to positive psychology. And arguably, tabletop role-playing games as a therapeutic tool, they don't need to be developed to be a therapeutic tool because they already are one. So just some further reading if people are interested. One of my favourite books, Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal, Celia Hodent's The Gamer's Brain and Video Games, and Gordon Callea's In Game would make some amazing additional reading for if any of people are interested in knowing more about games in general, video games, and immersion and design. Cool, I'm done.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lee. That was dead interesting. We've got chats open, so if you've got any questions, do feel free to chuck some questions. I see some virtual clapping there. I give you some in-person clapping too. Now, the first thing I was wondering about here was you're talking about tabletop art. Oh, actually, first thing I want to do is I'm going to ask a question which was asked earlier on, but it might be missed. You remember when you showed your table and you've got the table going across the two different dimensions?
Yeah.
Were tabletop RPGs, were they falling in the same place as something like World of Warcraft? So
TTRPGs aren't actually on there. I think they probably sit more complex and more social than World of Warcraft is, because we've got the pro-social components, but also that creativity and lack of boundaries, I guess. That's why I think TTRPGs are the pinnacle of gaming, because it's that open world, that freedom of design that means that even though games are becoming less and less invisible wall, they're still there. You know, I was speaking to somebody today who said they like playing Red Dead Redemption. It's a nice open world. I was like, absolutely. But you can't walk into the bar, ask for a part-time job, then buy the bar and run the bar. You know, you can do that if you want to in a TTRPG. There are so very few limits that it is more than just one game, which I guess we see in open worlds where they start saying, well, you know, you can go and you can hunt, you can gather this, you can create this. There's lots of different skill trees you can go to, but there is still a limit.
And what I was thinking about with TTRPGs is they've become kind of huge in the last few years, it seems. And some of that I expect is about COVID, because it's a low technology thing that you can do with people, and you can do it, as you were suggesting yourself, remotely. But you've got something else about why TTRPGs are taking off so much. Because, like, you know, if you go down to the local Waterstones, there's a TTRPG section, which would just have been unthinkable even 10 years ago.
Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I think it's become more mainstream in social media. Yeah, as Zoe said in the chat, Stranger Things helps. It definitely converted a lot of people. We've seen it in your Big Bang Theory, despite the fact that doesn't seem to have aged well. But we see it more across. We see places like your geek retreats popping up. There are physical locations now that represent these communities, and I think lockdown definitely helped. I mean, I'm one of the converts from lockdown, and now you can see from behind me the amount of TTRPGs that I've got, and I arguably spend I've probably got an average of 2.5 games a week. So I was definitely converted quite quickly.
Is there also maybe, and obviously I'm being careful who I say this to, I'm not making any suggestion myself, but is there also potentially a bit of an image problem associated with D&D? Because I've played a few campaigns, and something that really surprised me was how kind of dramatic they got, how kind of intense some of the combat sections got. I was like, oh no, my character might die. And suddenly, when two of our characters had to fight to the death, after one of us betrayed the other, then it was it got surprisingly emotional in a way that I wasn't necessarily thinking it would. And it makes me wonder if a lot of the kind of stigma about TTRPGs are generally coming from people who've never played them, but also maybe for people who aren't necessarily appreciating how an imaginary character in an imaginary world is still a part of us.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how many diverse different players will do, they are still rooted in who you are, because you're using your own frame of reference, your own sense of empathy, creativity, which is all linked to who you are personally. I think the stigma comes not just from it being TTRPGs, but adults playing in general. You know, from the games masters I've interviewed as part of my research, we see that young people really enjoy the role play stuff a bit more than combat. And the best analogy I can think of is in the episode of Friends where Chandler goes into Monica's bath and he feels it's very girly till he gets his toy submarine. The combat for adults in TTRPGs is the submarine, because it's like, well, I'm going to go play make believe with my friends, but I'm going to go kill stuff.
I've got, actually, that brings back to another question that was asked above, which was about what would you suggest is the best age to start kids on gaming? Now, I appreciate this will vary depending on the type of game we're talking about.
I think as soon as you're able to communicate with them, there is a certain level of creativity, of abstract thinking that is very unique to young people that is quelled by modern society. We're taught game as a reward, games are not valued because they're not work. Hopefully, myths I've tried to dispel today. But engaging young people in this, they can become so much more adaptive, more creative than adults are. And I think it's something we should try to not let extinguish. So the sooner the better.
Out of curiosity, I gather there's quite a few TTRPG folks in the audience. If you are, just I want to get a feel for who's watching. Could you click a like or something on the post that I just made saying TTRPGs? Just I'm curious as to who's watching this. Now, we've also got a question above, particularly about Baldur's Gate 3. I assume that's BG free. Do you think that's likely to increase the amount of TTRPG players?
I think so, because it's the closest we have to a video game being TTRPG. You know, we have the mechanisms. It's based on 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons with a few tweaks, some that I agree with, some that I don't. But it's letting people see that level of immersion. And the one thing I would say to people is if you want to make that feel more authentically like a TTRPG, never save your game.
I've got a question here from one of the people in the audience. Can you tell us more about your current research? Because I gotta say, you were a bit of a dark horse about the research you're doing yourself.
So I'm trying to write a conceptual paper looking at understanding well-being from children's perspectives using games, because it's a way to authentically and genuinely engage in their life world without bringing all the habits and assumptions of adulthood into it. We are interviewing games masters to see, and it was started as a logistics paper to see about what works and what doesn't work with young people in games. And it got so much more. The therapeutic potential, the benefits, the stories we got, it was absolutely massive. And one of my PhD students, Nika Glaunik, is doing her PhD on using TTRPGs as an intervention on young people carers, because games appeal to kids, but we want to instill all these benefits of gaming kind of sneakily under the guise of games, because they can be accessed remotely. So we're hoping to use that to improve hidden or hard to reach populations. But as I said, these interventions work across so many populations. I wouldn't want to limit it, but just a few examples of what we're doing.
Elsewhere from the chat, we've got thoughts about the importance of finding the right group of people for TTRPGs, because this person's brother tried to teach him and it did not seem like it went well. Curious as to what went wrong.
So either finding the right people is finding people you're friends with already. You're still going to strengthen those relationships, but you're going to have the existing social dynamics, and perhaps people will be a little bit more embarrassed to play or role play in front of people. On the other side of that, if you play with strangers, you've got the potential to build up relationships with new people. You've got less to lose socially if you feel like it's a bit of a risk to role play or to be a bit daft. So yeah, I guess finding the right people is based on, actually there was research that was done. That's a really good question. There was research that was done on whether or not you should choose to play with strangers or people you know. The main research finding was, how lonely are you? Higher perceived loneliness in people lends itself better to playing with strangers. Lower perceived loneliness lends itself to playing with friends. So that's a very academic way of saying both, but neither.
I've got some questions here. So interesting to hear about possible interventions. I've got a couple of questions. How long do you think... this question's suddenly gone away because of the thingy reloading. I believe the first part of it was about... here we go. How long do you think a TTRPG as an intervention would need to be?
It depends on the population. It depends on which of these outcomes you were hoping for. We can see changes in positive potential. I think 1, 3, 6 months, even a year in current research. But TTRPGs compared to video games have seen far less research, and it's still in the critical point just now. We're really having to walk these paths for the first time. Video games, we can see there are benefits, but again, I do think that the positive potential for TTRPGs is still even greater than those of video games.
Same person asks, how would that deaf idea translate into the actual intervention?
It can be a sense of acceptance. It can be a sense of understanding the concept of letting go, of finality. It's really interesting to read, and we're hopefully going to publish the results this year on how young people have dealt with character death, and surprisingly better than I imagined. You know, everyone crapped their pants when Dumbledore died in Harry Potter because they thought children were too vulnerable, but it turns out they're a lot more resilient than what we give them credit for.
Spot the sentence, so it will not make the edit we put on, we put on YouTube.
I had to do something.
And how long does it take to level up in a TTRPG?
Depends how adamant you can be against your GM. So you can have experiential based, where you get points for your achievements and accomplishments, combat, problem solving, etc., or milestone. For me, I think milestone is more meaningful because getting that reward and seeing that benefit and that transformative component at a critical juncture is more meaningful than, oh, well, you just got 2000 XP, bang, you're in the middle of the forest, level up.
What I find really interesting that's been raised is a comparison between TTRPGs and the idea that kids usually kind of do this sort of make-believe play to begin with. Mm-hmm. You know, as a kid, where suddenly like you might be playing whatever, I'm sure it's probably Marvel nowadays. But the idea that kids are willing to kind of world build like that at a young age, and maybe as we get older, we struggle to do that so much. I think that's a really interesting parallel.
Yeah, especially as young people, if we're not provided flow, we find it. And young people do it perfectly through games. They do it through creation. You'll see kids when they're bored create a new game, like any component of a game. They'll, you know, we all did that thing in the back of the car where you imagined the other person, like an imaginary person running across the scenery. You know, we'll find a way to engage ourselves and create. It's just, how do we manage to get ourselves to accept that we still need to do that as adults?
Someone has brought up the concept of honor mode. Gets very close to the never save your game feel. Very fun, very tense. What's the current path for games masters to become therapeutic GMs?
So I'm glad somebody asked that question. Come January 25, I will be hosting a new short course module called the Therapeutic Benefits and Application of TTRPGs. It is going to be very introductory, and based on the uptake and feedback of that, we'll hopefully manage to extend it potentially to a postgraduate certificate. There are other online courses, and there's a Geek Therapeutics over in America, but I think there's very little currently for universities for TTRPG specific courses. So I'm really happy to be doing that, you know, as one of the forerunners in the field. Also, I think there's the potential to go down a counselling route. You know, we've got COSCA, Counselling Psychotherapy Scotland. They've got some short courses and things that I think are really beneficial because, as I said, TTRPGs in of themselves are already therapeutic tools. Games masters, regardless of their background and training, are already providing therapeutic benefits to people.
I'm loving this exchange here. Educative systems should incorporate more gaming-involved development in early years. Then there's a follow-up. By the way, the reason I'm not using anyone's name is because we're recording this. The follow-up says, indeed, it's quite ironic that we put a lot of emphasis on child development through play, and as soon as a child develops skills, we take the play away or almost discourage it, let alone gaming. Hear. Do you have any thoughts on how this research can apply to the cozy gaming genre? They tend to avoid failure, and do you think that that's detrimental?
100%. I think experiencing failure is something we need to do in real life, in games. We see such a big shift across education that people are scared to say the wrong thing. And time again, I've got to tell them, this is a safe space to do it. This is where you make a mistake. It's my job to understand what assumption you made that wasn't correct, to help that and change it. before you go out into the world where mistakes, within jobs have consequences. And within games, we create such a definitive, safe and rewarding space that failures can be fun, they can be interesting, and we can learn to not fear it.
Just to get a record, cozy gaming, is that like a particular subtype, or is that just a sort of a set of agreed upon rules beforehand that people do?
I was assuming it was just colloquialism, but it might be an actual thing.
Oh, yeah, to the person who posted that, if you can define it, I'm curious as to if that's like an accepted term or kind of a term that you've created, which also works. Next comment's about spoilers. I could only assume that was about the Harry Potter spoilers. I guess the inspiration mechanic could be used to highlight reward and certain specific therapeutic actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rewarding inspiration, rewarding any action with a beneficial outcome is that positive conditioning. It's recognizing that effort, recognizing problem solving, innovation. I think inspiration is definitely something that could be used more often in a lot of games. But then there's so many instances of innovation and creativity and overcoming stuff that you don't want your place to have inspiration all the time. It should be rationed, otherwise it becomes less meaningful.
It was something we talked about so far with the educational application. It reminds me of not a particular fan of this comedian, but I saw Jimmy Carr talking about why stand-up should be taught in schools. And the argument that he made was what stand-up's really good for, and I'm thinking TTRPG is a lot of this as well, is it encourages people to think on their feet. It encourages people to accept a level of vulnerability and opening themselves up with others, even if we're still doing it through a persona, which is what we do in stand-up as well. And it kind of encourages creativity and innovation. I guess I'm wondering if there's other sort of skills like both of these that you think have that kind of value.
I think specifically for GMs, and I just saw a question pop up, what makes a good GM? I think that ties in, is the ability to yes and to improvise, to support, to limit how often you're ever going to say no. You want to support this shared narrative, and I guess a lot of that's problem solving, because the games masters are everyone else in the world. The player characters play their set character. The games master is the baker, the random beggar in the street, the old man in the dark corner of the pub. The games master is all of these things. And I think the skill set for a good games master is very much underrated, because when you're enjoying the game and you're in that flow state as a player, you don't see it until you reflect back and go, really enjoyed that game. It's allowing a sense of autonomy and ownership to your players, making things meaningful, creating that virtual concept of phasing, but within that world and setting you've created.
Yeah, and while I think a lot of people would maybe view D&D through the lens of combat, so much of this is also about satisfying storytelling. I mean, a good GM would also say, okay, this is the kind of story that I need to tell, but they're going to have, or that I want to tell, but and these are the beats I need, but they have flexibility. They might not come across this.
There is an element of choose door A and choose door B, and look, it's the same city that I just threw together 30 minutes before the game. But it's allowing your players to take the most insignificant thing within your world and make it interesting to them. About having something on the map that you hadn't decided was important, but it's not for you to decide what's important in the story. You create the world. It's your players that put life into it.
And absolutely, the way that, okay, the players have met this character. They were always going to meet this character. They'd be away, but it feels as if they discovered something. It's great.
Yeah.
Next comment. We level up, and I say we level up. I like the pattern in this group. Leveling up is a state of mind. And the deal with if the GM can be made, like my last game where the GM bet to level up against our ability to fully heal the injured. We won. Level up. It's got a full arc. And do you think there's a need to have consequences in these games?
Yeah, I think consequences make it meaningful. It makes it purposeful. If there's not consequences, your actions don't mean anything. There's nothing to be valued. I think even having unforeseen, unknowable actions and consequences is even more fun to put in your games, because your players don't just have a sense of ownership and autonomy. There's also the fun of the unpredictability.
Do you have strong views on plates as weapons?
Stop asking this in the chat. I know who you are. It's a good example though. In the games that me and my friends play, or some of my friends play, I don't want to exclude some other people. We one of my friends was in an antique shop and asked if there was Princess Diana commemorative plates. And much like the Cornetto trilogy, we now in all of our games have commemorative Princess Diana plates. So we've got a really straight. There's one hanging up on my wall. We all got one as presents. So that's the only time you'll see royal memorabilia in my house.
Apparently, for young players aged 7 to 10, there's a very good game called No Thank You Evil. Seems like everyone likes it. Cozy games is a genre. Excellent. Oh, it's like Stardew Valley. That I have heard of.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, Stardew Valley has consequences. I mean, I think there's nothing more infuriating than going to that shop when it's not open.
Do you feel that tabletop RPGs can be used more in conjunction with work rather than school, like as a tool for HR or training?
Yeah, there's a massive organizational potential for these games. As I said, it increases social democracy, group work, communication. There's not a single point or a single aspect of life where you work, operate, rely, interact with other people that would not benefit from these skills being developed.
Therapeutic games masters, is this a real thing or just something academic?
Yeah, this is a real thing. I think we've got a couple in the chat as well. It's a course by Geek Therapeutics, I think. I'm not 100% sure on how protected the term is and how translatable it is from the US to here. But as I said, I think TTRPGs are in of themselves therapeutic, regardless of the intent.
Next, during lockdown, I set up a gaming group for the community mental health team I work for. Really informal setup, but the benefits were huge. Currently setting it up in a slightly more formal way will likely incorporate TTRPGs for a face-to-face element of groups. Totally agree with the benefits. Excellent. By the way, there's a heck of a lot of compliments of your presentation in the chat as well. I'm just going to the ones at the side.
I'll wait until tomorrow when I have some self-doubt and I'll sit and bask in it. It's fine.
Quantum ogres are a wonderful thing for every GM, but there's an ongoing debate over whether this is a good thing. Does this reflect differently in therapeutic settings?
I'm not sure quantum ogres work like quantum physics, so they only exist because we look at them.
I was thinking about doing occasional TTRPG sessions to encourage PhD stroke other research students to work on various social and interactional skills, but a bit worried about it being awkward or putting pressure on them to perform. Any advice?
As a GM, have the flexibility to know that you're creating a safe space for people to interact in if they want to. It can be as simple as describing the world around them to instill them to want to act, or even just to recognize that their existence is meaningful. If your player wants to be the strong silent type and walk into a busy tavern, having that tavern go deathly silent and describe how the characters are looking at them with a sense of, assessment, fear, reverence, whatever it is, still creates that sense of purpose and meaning. And should, I'm not giving you promises, should facilitate your players to come out their shells a little bit
more. I'm going to temporarily leave your TTRPG exceptionalism and go on to the other end of the technological spectrum. And this is about VR. So I don't know about everyone on here. As someone who's played VR a little bit, I find it absolutely amazing how immersive it gets. Especially first when you're doing VR and you suddenly fall and then like you just feel a whoosh at you or something. And I guess what I'm wondering about is in terms of the way that technology is evolving, in terms of the sorts of new possibilities that we have when it comes to inventing creative new worlds, I guess I'm wondering what you think the kind of what do you think the sort of long-term way we can use this in psychology is, or what you think the sort of implications of greater technological immersion are going to be?
I mean, the greater the immersion, the less, I guess, onus there is on the game design to have to put you into that position. You put on a headset, and I think you can fall into it very easily. But arguably, when you're playing a really good game, a good TTRPG, that you're in that flow state, you don't recognize that you're not watching a movie, that you're not playing a video game per se. It's the same with 3D films. The only time you ever notice a film's in 3D is when you're not invested in watching it. When you go, oh, look, that's 3D, you're not thinking, oh, that's a good film, I'm enjoying this.
And I suppose actually in terms of the creative aspect, if you see much of a parallel between the way that TTRPGs work and the way that, say, the act of reading works in terms of the use of creative imagery. Because as much as I tell myself like, oh, my visual imagination's rubbish, it occurs to me I'm a very avid reader, and a big part of that's about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say books are the basis of being beyond movies, because in a book you get that introspection, you get the reflection, you get an access to the character that you don't get watching a film or watching TV. When you create a story or a narrative and have it as a video game, that's when you get that autonomy. You get a sense of direction, a sense more of purpose, because you are taking ownership of the story or you're more involved in it. And then again, that leads to hierarchical structured TTRPGs where you're not limited to the structure. You know, it is that level of freedom, exploration, and reward that comes with that very open, very dynamic, very real time design that TTRPGs can afford.
I'm delighted to see somebody else brought up the book parallel as well. Just as I was saying it, see, we're very alike there. Got a definition of quantum ogres. Quantum ogres are a term for an obstacle that players will encounter regardless of which path they take. Whether they go north or east to get to the dungeon, they will always encounter an ogre on the way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think it comes down to who's that for? Are you wanting that to be in the game because you've put time and effort in designing it and you think your players will like it and they've avoided it through circumstance, happenstance, whatever it is? Or is it something they actively want to do? Is it something a player's been like, oh, I really want to kill an ogre, for example, to keep it on the same theme? Then yeah, put it in. But again, always question whose purpose it is. To me, the games masters have got to get something out of this too, you know? And it can be really rewarding seeing your players completely screw up your plans and do the complete opposite thing. And you have to ad-lib an entire session. And when you ad-lib an entire session on the fly and somebody goes, I really enjoyed that, and you go, I'm really glad you enjoyed that.
Thinking actually, it's one of the things that's really nice about TTRPGs versus other types of gaming is the relatively low cost of them, right? Because whilst, don't be wrong, I appreciate they're always releasing new volumes of books, etc., and new rule books. At the same time, the actual like on the day gaming can require a few figurines, a map for combat, if that, and just people having bits of paper with numbers on it. And I think that's maybe one of the I suppose actually in a way you can almost parallel that with football, where part of the reason it's maybe such a popular sport is the absolute lack of money that you have to spend to be able to play it. You know, football you do require trainers, but then you just have jumpers as goalposts.
Yeah, which I mean is why I think it's really fun to see the dichotomy of people that are DMs, even forever DMs for their friends, and they play very informally, but also people who pay and hire games masters privately, because if you think about the time and effort it goes into developing these games, it's massive. You know, it's having that flexibility and enough story, enough tangents to go on and to write the details and to plan out characters' ambitions is massive. You know, it's such a huge aspect that ties into that purpose of the shared narrative. A game is only as good as what the GM, creates it and how immersed the players can be within it, I suppose.
But the best games are the ones that are created by everyone at the table. So that's a good motto.
Yeah, it's a shared narrative. I love that term. It really is.
We got the question about, although this was actually answered below, there's a question about the for TTRPGs, D&D is often is maybe by the average punter such as myself, D&D is probably used relatively synonymously with TTRPGs. And I'm wondering if there's other systems that you would recommend for people who aren't necessarily into D&D or other things except D&D.
Yeah, I mean, we can use it to rope people in by their hobbies and interests. There's Star Wars, Star Trek, The Witcher. There's a Rick and Morty TTRPG. They're becoming more and more popular in the way that I think people are trying to rope people in by genre rather than by TTRPG itself. And I guess it depends what you like to play. I still really am a massive fan of D&D because 5th edition is, I think, quite easy to understand. You've also got other systems like Pathfinder. There's Blades in the Dark, the Vampire something. I'm drawing a blank on what it's actually called. I'm sure somebody in the chat can tell us. But yeah, it's a case of finding what you enjoy and doing it. And I think the best systems, the ones that have the most therapeutic potential, are the ones that are the most flexible, the ones that are the most responsive and dynamic to players' actions, the ones that have the most meaning, the most defined purpose.
I'm loving this phrase of comparing RPGs to it's like writing while reading.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I remember seeing a meme being like, I really want to play D&D, but just by myself. And somebody's like, that's writing a book.
This is where the critical role live play phenomenon has led to so many more new players in the game. And we've got the brands one. Vampire the Masquerade is apparently.
I knew the chat would help us out with that one.
I'd like to move on to the other type of gaming we haven't really mentioned. We've only got 8 minutes, by the way. So any other questions, do feel free to put them in, because Lee will have to go off and do the next D&D round. I think some of his part you're watching this right now. Yeah. So one other thing I want to mention is board games. Now, board games have quite pleasingly had a huge revival in the last few years. So. Mm-hmm. The global market for board games reached 15.1 billion in 2022, and it's projected to reach almost twice that, of 29.7 by 2028. Why do you think board games are coming back so much?
Because we're finding more creative ways to immerse ourselves socially are more rewarding. I think I touched on it when I said about, Zoom during lockdown. Drinks over Zoom got boring very quickly. But TTRGPGs over lockdown was still purposeful. And again, when you're doing games, you've got a sense of competition or collaboration, depending on the game, but it's a sense of purpose, achievement, and overall, I guess the biggest tagline from this is games are fun. It's most rudimentary, but most true.
Actually, in the spirit of that, and with the exception of D&D, across different modalities, what are your games of choice?
Tell me you're going to ask me this. Console-wise, Dragon Age, or Civilization 6. Board game-wise, also Civilization. A game my friends recently bought me called Coup. Maybe Settlers of Catan. We tried to play 2 games of that in turn before. I recommend 1 game at a time. But generally anything with a decent group of people. I've played board games, and TTRPGs with my friends. Obviously with your friends over time, you strengthen those relationships and qualities. But I now have so many people who were strangers before lockdown and during lockdown that I would now consider very close friends who I might not have even met in real life yet. And those bonds have been strengthened and created just through these games.
Got a comment that so one person posting here, when their teenager plays D&D with her friends, they all spend most of the time in hysterics. I think that's, again, the creativity aspect just seems such an important part,
I mean, I'm in my mid-30s and I still play D&D and mostly hysterics most of the time too, so.
People think you've got good taste. People like Dragon Age for the win, and Catan as well has also got its fans. By the way, if anyone in the chat wants to just tell us their favorite game of some sort, happy to hear it. 42 here, and the fun does not stop. It's a good thought. As someone approaching 40, I hope it doesn't go away. Skyrim, excellent stuff. When it comes to people who are maybe a bit shy about starting to play, but not coming in and this isn't so much about what a DM can do, but if you're looking at maybe a slightly socially inhibited player coming into games for the first time, what kind of advice would you give to them?
I mean, TTRPGs are like a cult. If people know you're new, they will do everything in their power to support you and make sure you play and you enjoy it. Go into it with the only expectation of, I'm going to have fun. Don't worry about the rules. Don't worry about making mistakes. Don't worry about not knowing the right thing to do in regards to, rolling initiative or what to cast, or it comes with time. The priority for new players and the priority for everybody is the first thing to do is enjoy
it. Lots of people here are big fans of Mass Effect, which is my favorite game series of all time. An Elden Ring fan. I'm thinking, that was a difficult one. And has anyone else got any last questions? We currently have 3 minutes left. So basically, any last questions, now's the time to get them. Otherwise, I shall just ask my big grand question of, what do you see as the future for gaming?
I see it being incorporated more and more into daily life. I think we're on the start of that snowball avalanche now. I want to see it in schools. I mean, arguably, I'm saying, can we teach teachers how to be games masters? We never said, how do we teach the physics teacher to teach drama? There's maybe scope for, a games teacher. I think we need to look at the current infrastructures in question where we can put games, flow states, and accomplishment back into all aspects of our life to make them more purposeful and meaningful.
Excellent. And here's a positive thought for us to end on, unless anyone's got any last second questions. Gamers are the most lovely kind of people, the most lovely group, and very supportive. That's why you should all be gamers and be friends with gamers.
Yeah, it is such a safe space. We see it across the board. It's very inclusive, very diverse, very accepting. I mean, I'm still not seeing that across the board. If you Google Crit Crab, you'll see people's maybe more challenging experiences, but the challenging experiences are very, very, very much in the minority.
I'm wondering, and I'm not trying to bash video games here, I'm wondering if there's maybe a slight difference in maybe in how competitive these get, because I suppose with tabletop RPGs, you're all playing together, right? Whereas the amount of times I've played video games online and, I hear people slagging me off as they shoot me or something. I think video games seem to have a bit more of an antisocial culture that's maybe unfairly stereotyped about them in a way that I don't necessarily see with TTRPG. And I'm wondering if the cooperative element's a big part.
I think a lot of that is stemmed with some of these social games, or multiplayer games, that instill a level of frustration in people, and they feel that they're in a detached enough space that they can, vent their spleen and vitriol and be the worst possible version of themselves. TTRPGs are collaborative. As much as we can have a little bit of in-party competition sometimes, it is a shared goal, a shared purpose. In these video games and multiplayer games, we have, as you said, new people, which more experienced players do not welcome. We see the reverse of that in TTRPGs. As I said, it's a cult. Run.
And on that note, run towards your local playtest test of D&D games, folks. That's all we have time for, because we have to urgently get Lee to his next round of D&D. But a huge thank you very much for everybody that's participated in this. Thank you to everybody that's been asking questions. That's made this chat absolutely delightful. I see lots and lots of warmth on here. Warms the heart to see gamers from all the different parts of it. I think we've got an international audience here. It's great.
I should say as well, just the relentless plug, please do email me at l.bogue@rgu.ac.uk if you're interested in hearing more about the short course of the therapeutic benefits of TTRPGs that will be starting in January 25. I'm happy to answer questions and have a preliminary list of people who are excited or interested.
Excellent. And hopefully we'll see you again soon for some more of these events. Next community seminar, as I said, it was going to be about the weaponization of the concept of wokeness in the press. And there's also going to be one which is going to be all about the life and career of Mick Lynch. So lots and lots of good ones coming up. We wish you all a fond farewell, everybody. And keep on gaming.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.